Hi there, everyone. As you're coming in today, I want to thank you for coming to our webinar today. My name is Marcia. I'm the webinar director here at Advice Chaser. Before we introduce our guest and get started, I do need to do a little bit of legal housekeeping. Advice Chaser, the host of this webinar, is not a registered investment advisor. We cannot and do not give financial advice. Today's presentation is for educational purposes only and cannot be considered advice for any person's individual situation. Advice Chaser regularly hosts informative webinars such as this one, featuring a variety of knowledgeable professionals, many of whom are licensed advisors. Any opinions, ideas, jokes, or principles expressed by presenters are their own, and however true, funny, or interesting are not endorsed by Advice Chaser. Please do not act on the information you hear today without consulting a qualified financial professional. Well, we are thrilled to bring you today's educational presentation. Attendees are muted, but you're welcome to ask questions in the chat box. And if we're not able to get to that, we will make sure to reach out to you and make sure that question gets addressed. We want this experience to be as educational as possible, and we've prepared this presentation specifically to address what we think are some of the most common questions about this topic. We hope you will enjoy it today. Well, I'd love to introduce you to today's presenter. John O'Bannon is a financial advisor with Diversified Financial Group. Working closely with his clients and their CPA, attorney, and other professionals, John helps to design a prudent financial strategy specifically tailored for his client's family, or their businesses. Assisting with the retirement savings so you have more options when you retire, creating a strategy to pay for expected education expenses, and partnering with business owners in evaluating their business retirement plans and their transition strategies. This is what John does. John has enjoyed working with a variety of clients over the years. He's made the most impact with small business owners, women post-divorced or widowed, professionals, and executives at local companies throughout the Midwest and across the nation. And I'm going to go ahead and turn over the time to you, John. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm excited to get into today's topic.
Thank you, Marcia. Welcome to those that have joined us today. Hopefully, we present some things that are new to you, and at least get the thoughts rolling. And you have lots of questions at the end of it. That's really my biggest role. The biggest question today is, what is a fiduciary? I'm sure you've heard a lot about it in the current TV advertising, and it's not going to slow down anytime soon with some of the changes that are going on in the industry that actually take place at the end of June and the beginning of July. We'll get into some of those things later in the presentation, but certainly it's a hot topic, and it's absolutely changing the industry, and certainly, in my view, for the better. So to define what a fiduciary is quite literally, from a legal perspective, it's a fancy word that says an individual that is legally responsible to do actions on your behalf or give advice on your behalf that is solely for your benefit first, foremost, regardless of any sort of benefit to that person that's giving the advice. Historically, some of those roles that would have a fiduciary responsibility would be lawyers, specifically. Of course, everyone would think of that, but also trustees. So if you have a trust or know of them, those that are listed as trustees, again, have to act on behalf of anyone that is potentially a beneficiary of that trust. Of course, corporate officers, those that the CEOs, the CFOs, and as they talk about like quarterly reports and those kinds of things, they have to act in the best interest of the organization and even the investors that might be invested, shareholders and the like. And so therefore, disclosures and things that of that nature that they would talk about, they would be legally responsible for and have to stand for. So as this relates to a financial advisor, thankfully, now it's one of those situations where what we provide to you, when it gets into a distinction of actual advice and not just an explanation or definition, somewhat like today's presentation or webinar, is we are explaining these things, but there's no advice given. And there's a very clear distinction there, somewhat to the effect that some individuals may be going online and maybe they'll do a trade on their own, or they have their own side account, and whatever website or whatever source they use to do that, the fees are very low and they're usually per transaction. And that's because there's no advice. Even if they say this type of investment has these qualities and it's said to be a solid investment, the fine line there is saying that this is appropriate for you and it fits into what's your plan and what you're trying to accomplish. That is the fine line, and that is the definition of where a fiduciary comes into play, and how you would then see them either helping you specifically with either your business or your retirement funds, or even just an individual security or bond or things of that nature. So it's good to understand the clarity there, and when that fiduciary role is enacted, if you will. More broadly, the most important thing for advisors is that there aren't any misleading comments or misleading deletions of information. So for example, if you don't talk about fees and if you don't talk about timelines, that would be considered misleading. It is something that you as an individual investor should be asking and should also be receiving answers on. Of course, having full disclosure and much beyond the multiple envelopes of information that show up probably monthly or quarterly for you, full of disclosures. Even when you're talking about an individual situation, an advisor needs to be giving you kind of the A, B, and C of what really happens behind the scenes, and if there are underlying fees or underlying qualifications. Whether you fully understand them or not, and you should ask to have them clarified if you don't, but those things should be covered. Again, historically, there may not have been those disclosures. And it was kind of that gray area of whether or not that advisor individually thought that that was something to be covered or not. Legally now, when they're talking about bringing in fiduciary duty into the industry, these are now requirements. And these are things where that advisor can and should be held accountable if those things aren't being discussed. Additionally, a big thing is conflicts of interest, and even to the extent where an advisor being like, let's say, a treasurer for a nonprofit organization, or being close to being on the board of a municipality, or for state government, those are all conflicts. And so the idea is to root out all of those things, because an advisor could say to you, I have this great investment that's, low interest or no interest, or on the flip side, it's guaranteed to return. But that person has direct involvement with that organization, certainly a conflict of interest that historically may not have always been reported or held to. And so all of those things that may not kind of be in everyone's typical environment to think about, the government has said they absolutely need to be included, because you, an investor, intentionally or not, might be misled to think one thing, when maybe there's other things going on. So all of those considerations are great. Along with the fiduciary responsibilities, certainly you would expect that there would be some sort of fee, because of that legal responsibility, and then therefore the protection from the advisor's perspective, like whether it's insurance that needs to be brought in, or any of those things, to make sure that all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. You as an investor can have a very clear, quick understanding of whether or not the person you're working with or the investments you're having managed are fiduciary or not. Really kind of apples and oranges. There's commission, or there's a transactional, there's either a monthly fee or an individual commission. If there's a commission, that's one buy, one charge, and then from that point forward, there's little to no fee. And that's usually buried, and we're not going to get into that, but if there's a commission up front of some sort of percent, there's probably not a fiduciary responsibility. If there's an ongoing fee, much like your cell phone, for instance, it's a monthly or it's an annual fee. In that wrap is typically, of course, then the fee for that ongoing advice, and then therefore the fiduciary responsibility, and legal standing. It's usually an either or. That is also to say that you may have different types of accounts if you have an advisor, that you pay a fee on X portion, but you pay a commission on the other part. And then the commission might only be for individual securities or things of that nature, individual stocks, because you're going to buy it, you're going to hold it, you're not going to mess with it. So there can be a blend, and it can be intentionally a good thing for you. The big thing is just to understand which part is doing what and why. So that's really the biggest difference there, is just to make sure that you understand if there's a fee involved of either a monthly or a quarterly or an annual, then you probably can bank on that there's a fiduciary responsibility. If you're thinking, well, all I have is whatever I have at work, and it's a 401k or 403b, there is a fiduciary role in that, but that is usually held by the employer. And so again, as an individual investor, there is someone watching out for you, and there's also someone responsible for that. How this all was set up is, as everyone's heard of, the SEC, Security Exchange Commission, is kind of the overarching watchdog, or essentially the arm of the government that oversees all financial transactions of any type. Everything from corporate America listing or not listing themselves and, to be publicly traded, to down to the very bottom of, your local town wants to do a bond referendum to build a school. Everything in the middle, including what you do traded, falls under the SEC. They don't necessarily watch every single detail. There's certainly levels of the government that take care of the local bond issue, and then there's a whole different group of folks that watch international companies and so on. Just know that the SEC sees it all. Their enforcement arm, if you will, is called FINRA. And if there's any sort of violation, FINRA is the one that will evaluate and actually determine whether or not there was a violation or not a violation of the SEC rules and laws. You may or may not hear of some of those things throughout, but that's how they work together. But they're both at a national government level. The Department of Labor is a separate arm of the government that has been pulled into the SEC because the Department of Labor traditionally always had oversight of retirement dollars. And that is whether that's in corporate America or an individual establishment, or if that's government retirement, if you're a teacher or you work for the state or whatever, all retirement dollars fell under the Department of Labor. The biggest changes that are coming have to deal with retirement dollars. And then from there, the SEC understood that there's this huge industry of retirement. And so bringing in fiduciary into all of that covers the vast majority of the individual investors' assets. So that's where we're going to focus. And that's how we're going to start to expand oversight on the behalf of the individual investor. At the end of the day, the government sees that if they don't empower the individual to invest on their own, at some point down the future, the government is going to have to support people's retirements through Social Security and other programs. So the best way to solve that potential major problem of having people underfunded for their retirement years is to assist them when they're younger with 401k plans and all those kinds of programs. But people have to trust those. If they don't trust them, they won't use them. So the best way to do that is to say, well, the people that run those programs, advisors, employers, and the like, they need to be legally held accountable, which is calling them fiduciaries, and therefore then holding them to that standard of a fiduciary that says you're legally always going to put the client first, even if that means you make less or you make no financial gain. You're always going to do what's best for that investor or that client. So from the very top all the way down to the state regulation, there's always someone that's looking over your investments and what's quote unquote appropriate. And the interesting thing is that the government leaves each area of the level of government to determine how they're going to hold themselves accountable to the standard of a fiduciary. They're not going to write it in black and white. They just set broad parameters that say you need to do what's right for the client. And each level of the government, and then of course each financial advisor, which is represented by a broker dealer, has to then say, okay, this is how we're going to meet that standard, and we're going to hold ourselves to that by this level, and they'll approve that and so on. So there's a lot of different ways to answer that question, but you as a financial as an advisor need to ask those questions. What do they do to fulfill the responsibility of being a fiduciary? Backing up as to
John, I think you meant like you as a client, not you.
Yes, I'm sorry. As a client, I apologize. Thank you. How we got here shortly and quickly is that back in the 40s, so 1974, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA, was created. That was the first step by the government to step into people's retirement plans. Prior to that, if there were any sort of retirement offered by employers, they were always in the way of pensions. And the employer was the fiduciary and said, we are going to invest, for the greater good of whatever, 1,400 employees or 14,000 employees, didn't matter. But we are going to take their money every month and we're going to invest it so that when they hit 60, they're going to have guaranteed income. We've all heard of stories of organizations dipping into that and so on. So there was a little bit of corruption that was happening. And so in the 60s and finally into 70s, they instituted this law that said, you're a fiduciary when you have these plans. Well, those organizations immediately saw that legal potential ramification, and they started to bring in 401k plans and 403 plans that really put that responsibility on the investor. And as long as the employer offered valid and quality investments for you to put your money in, they were no longer legally liable because you chose those investments. So it was definitely a step in the right direction. And it stayed that way, quite honestly, for 40, almost 50 years, right? So back in 2017, if many of you remember, there was kind of this big hubbub with just the Department of Labor, and it was just your retirement dollars if you wanted to roll your money either out of your 401k plan into a different IRA or the next employer. A lot of people moving jobs. So there may have been a conversation that you had either with your advisor or at work that said, hey, these retirement dollars, if we're going to leave them here, you either have to choose, do you want me to be your fiduciary and then therefore pay a fee? Or do you want to leave them where they are, but they're going to be a set it and forget it. And the way that we've got them today is where they're going to stay. So if that kind of rings a bell, that's where all of this started from in 2017. And it went through the legal course that our courts do of being challenged of being constitutional or not or constitutional or unconstitutional. Two district courts had conflicting views. One said it was constitutional, the other said it wasn't. They essentially let it expire in 2019 because they knew that the SEC was working on and was going to come out with this new DOL 2.0 that starts July 1st of this year. And it encompasses more than just your 401k if you're moving it to your 403b. It actually encompasses all retirement dollars. So if you have an existing IRA someplace that's separate, or you are inheriting, mom or dad's IRA, whatever that might be, it will cover that. And a big thing to understand is that, again, this isn't a law, this is a rule, meaning there's not a black and white definition of the fiduciary role in regards to your money. There are general standards to live by. For instance, what a prudent investor would do is what actions you should take regarding how you invest or how you do things. So with the words a prudent investor is that difference between a rule and a law. So for instance, the broker dealer that I work with, how we define what that prudent investor does versus other broker dealers is slightly different. And so maybe the paperwork will be different or the process. But all across the industry, what that means to you as the individual investor is that there's going to be more process going forward when you change jobs or you start to invest additionally outside of your work retirement plan. Not bad. It's just going to be different. And typically that's going to be a few extra forms. And for me as the advisor, there's a lot more background work that I have to do to show and bring information to you that says this is what you're being charged currently with your current jobs retirement plan. This is where you could go and what they're charging and what options they have. And then if you were to move to an individual IRA, these are your fees and this is the options that you have. So it just means there's going to be a lot more intentional decisions made before you're able to move your money from one place to the other. It seems like a lot of extra work for extra work, but it's truly an effort by the government to say each individual investor, as best as they can or as much as they want to, should understand what they have and what they're working toward and what it's costing to do that. Put it that way, that's not a bad thing. It just means it's going to be different, right? So additionally, not just relationships with your 401k, but it's going to be any retirement dollars that you have outside of your work retirement plans. If you have an advisor, you have individual investments, it will affect that. Insurance is also getting brought into this rule change for the very fact that if you have annuities or you have other types of investment type of insurance, well, the only way that they can increase the value of whatever that policy is to have underlying assets, just like you have in your own IRA. Well, it kind of makes sense then to also have the same type of or similar oversight of those type of products, even though I think most people don't see insurance as an investment or a coupling tool to your retirement plans. Although it should be, there are things that you can do with insurance that you can't do with just buying securities, and whether that's tax planning or transferring assets through your estate, sometimes that insurance is really critical to that. Okay, well then therefore it should fall under the investment universe and the rules that we have. Again, all to make sure that you as an individual are getting assistance with all things in your universe and not just one specific stock or one specific IRA plan. No, everything matters to you and everything should be looked at. And so when you are consolidating IRAs or you receive an inheritance of an IRA or assets, all of those transactions now will be looked at by the SEC and the industry as a whole. And there's going to just be a lot more questions asked. Again, not because we want to be nosy, but it's truly, how does this best fit in your overall plan? And is this genuinely the right thing for you? Um, and that's great. It's the way it should be. So one of those things, of course, is if you have an advisor, maybe you haven't heard from that person, or maybe you don't have one, and maybe you don't think you need one. But the idea of trying to go find an advisor is absolutely something, a topic that a lot of folks, when they start getting close to retirement or early to retirement, you've never had advisor. Okay, it's not a bad thing. You've gotten to where you are and you've been successful. But when you start thinking about using a professional to assist you, there's a lot of really good questions. The first, of course, are they a fiduciary? And again, there's reasons to be and to not be a fiduciary on certain buckets of money. A lot of times it has to do with fees over a long period of time. But ask them that, and not only should they give you clear and concise answers of we charge X percent, or no, we do trades of individual securities or individual stocks, because we understand that in 5 years, we're going to have held that stock and not do anything. So why should I charge you for 5 years just to hold it? But if we're constantly rebalancing and bringing in advice as the market moves, we're going to do things. Okay, well, there's advice there. So being clear on what those fees are is critical, and they should be able to write that down and make that clear for you. And if it's not written, if it's not something you can tangibly hold, either ask for that, or maybe, continuing to find a search into an advisor who will. And certainly reach out to trusted sources that you have, whether that's family members or friends that are maybe in a similar economic situation as yourself. But know that even in the last 10 years, the industry has changed so dramatically that all those recommendations are good recommendations. Don't take them on blind faith, just because there's a lot of different ways. I tend to find that the most successful relationships with an advisor and a client is your similar personalities, and you think generally about life the same way. Doesn't mean you have to be the same age. And quite honestly, if you're 65, you'd probably prefer a 40 or 50-year-old advisor, right? They're going to be around, but they still see the same values as you. That's really, really important. And as I mentioned, insurance is becoming more of an understood tool in the tool belt of investing, that earlier in the life of investment, it's always looked at as it's protecting you from dying too soon, right? To pay off the house or take care of the family. But as you age, that insurance flips and it becomes to protect you from, outliving your money, or protects from blind spots that just owning bonds or owning land cannot protect you from, whether that's health related, tax related. So insurance really becomes a tool that specifically fills investment objectives that no other asset can do. And your advisor should be able to talk to those things. Now, not all advisors love insurance or are nearly as educated on that, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just they want to be specialized in maybe portfolio management or whatever that might be. But again, find what's important to you, and if it is important that someone understands insurance, then absolutely find an advisor who can do that, and who understands how to use that to your advantage when it comes to taxes or passing on assets to the next generation, or when you're giving money away. That's a huge thing that can be taken advantage of. So again, kind of finding out what you value the most is what your advisor should be schooled in. And if that person's not, then don't feel bad. Keep looking. And that's, the most critical thing for you. Certainly on the back end, you can have, as in a lot of industries, you can have alphabet soup behind your name of certifications and licenses and some of those things, and I have them too, but those mean you have great levels of education, but try to balance that with, can my person explain things in a way that I can understand? And do they fulfill a fiduciary when they need to? Do the fees, are they appropriate for what I'm getting? And then the level of education certainly is important. But traditionally, you don't get to sit in the seat of an advisor if you haven't passed a lot of tests and a lot of certifications. So although important, I guess give it the weight that it's due. And of course, there's an online website, it's brokercheck.org. And that will have every broker out there. And historically, if they've had any complaints, you have to kind of read through, much like you do when you go to any sort of reviews on products that you've had. You kind of have to weed through those comments of level of seriousness or level of challenge for yourself. But it is absolutely a step that you should take when you're looking for a new advisor, just to see, how long they've been in the industry or other things like that. And again, give it its weight that it's due. So there are lots of things and lots of places for you to search for advisors and ask for advisors, and absolutely do the due diligence in finding that. And the fiduciary portion is becoming more and more common, but it's still not everywhere. But it's absolutely a value to you, the individual. And if nothing else, this presentation is hopefully there to give the value that a fiduciary provides, and it's not just a fee that's added.
Well, John, thank you so much for this great information. I do want to tell our attendees that if you have any questions that we haven't addressed during this webinar, you're welcome to leave that in the chat, and we'll go ahead and address those after the webinar today. We'll make sure to reach out to you. Just go ahead and leave your contact information. On behalf of Advice Chaser, I want to thank John and the organizations that have made this webinar possible today. Here at Advice Chaser, we're all about helping you find a financial advisor who's a great fit for your life and your financial questions. Our matching service is free to you, and every one of our partner advisors has agreed to offer a free initial consultation to anyone we introduce them to. Again, from Advice Chaser, thank you so much for coming, and we will see you at another webinar soon. Bye, everyone.